and welcome to Chapter 29 of AMSCO U.S. History, Limits of a Superpower from 1969 to 1980. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, thumbs up if you like, comment, and share these videos with your friends. Thanks so much. The New Right was a modern republicanism new political movement that formed around the time when LBJ was in office, and it happened around the election of '64. Republicans nominated a really big conservative, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, and even though he lost, he was able to energize many young conservatives of the time, including Ronald Reagan of California, who was just a film actor and TV host at the time, who would later become president. It also led to the rise of Richard Nixon after LBJ. When Richard Nixon came into office, he instituted the plan of Vietnamization. This was a plan to gradually withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam and give the South Vietnamese money, weapons, and training they needed to take over the Vietnamese War. And you can see this in the reduction of troops. Troops declined severely after 1969 to 1972. The Nixon Doctrine was also a big part of this. It declared that in the future, Asian allies would receive U.S. support, but without the extensive use of ground troops. So no more direct military action. This was a form of disengagement. Fighting the war in Vietnam was brutal. In the 70s, the American public learned about a 1968 massacre of women and children by U.S. troops in the Vietnam village of My Lai. What happened was an angry army officer was fired upon by different places in the village, so he ordered his troops to round up all the villagers and executed them all. It was really bad, and it contributed heavily to the anti-war sentiment back home. Nixon and his Secretary of State, Kissinger, wanted to strengthen the U.S. position in the world by taking advantage of a rivalry between two communist giants, China and the Soviet Union at this time, of course. So they used diplomacy, especially détente, which is French for stop, and it was a deliberate reduction of Cold War tensions between these countries. Nixon and Kissinger wanted to conduct foreign affairs in a way that would enhance world peace for the future. New Federalism also grew during this time. Its plan was conducted under Nixon, and it was supposed to slow the growth of Johnson's Great Society or Great Welfare programs. It had a family assistance plan that replaced welfare by providing a guaranteed annual income for all working Americans. The congressional Democrats didn't like this, so they said no. This plan also shifted some of the responsibility for social programs from the federal to the state and local levels, so sort of decentralizing all these political systems. Revenue sharing, or this new federalism, gave Congress the ability to give block grants, basically big packages of money, to local needs as they saw fit. So instead of using federal money directly in Washington to spread out and control everything at a local level, Congress would just give money to these local governments so these local governments could choose to use it however they wanted. It really wanted to check the growth of the federal government and return the responsibility to the states, kind of like before the New Deal. Nixon attempted to bypass Congress's blocking by impounding or not spending these funds and appropriating for other social programs. Democrats didn't like this once again, and they thought it was an abuse of executive powers, which they would say a lot. They thought it was the duty of the president to carry out the laws of Congress, whether or not the president agreed with them. The era members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, placed an embargo on oil sold to Israel supporters, so the U.S. was a big supporter of Israel during this time. It caused a worldwide oil shortage and long lines at gas stations in the United States. The U.S. economy also suffered. It had bad inflation, a loss of manufacturing jobs, and a lower standard of living for blue-collar or like the factory workers. Consumers also switched from big American-made cars to smaller, more fuel-efficient Japanese cars, such as Toyotas and Hondas. And this really took a big toll on the U.S. automobile industry because, of course, it was a big industry at this time, and they produced a lot of American wealth. Congress responded to the shortage by enacting a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit to save gas on highways. And they also constructed a controversial oil pipeline to try to get oil out of Alaska. Many people didn't like this, especially environmentalists. It didn't work, and this oil shortage and problem continued to the end of the decade. The biggest issue with the economy at this time was stagflation. It started with a recession in the 70s. The US economy throughout the 70s was really slow, and it had a crazy combination of economic slowdown and high inflation. And this was referred to stagflation. It's basically economic stagnation plus inflation. Nixon at first tried to cut federal spending, but it didn't work. So then he tried to use Keynesian economics, kind of like New Deal and FDR, to help this deficit spending and to help the middle class and blue-collar Americans, who were his voter base. In 71, he surprised the nation by imposing a 90-day wage and price freeze to try to control this economic meltdown, but it didn't really work either. He also tried to take the dollar off the gold standard, which helped to devalue it relative to foreign currencies, and we still have this dollar off the gold standard today. Another thing was a surtax on all imports. This improved the U.S. balance of trade with foreign competitors and helped American industry improve just a little bit better than before. He also tried to institute a Southern strategy politically. He only received 43% of the popular vote in 68, so he was definitely a minority president. His political strategy was to form a strong Republican majority and appeal to many millions of voters who didn't like the anti-war protest black militants such as the Black Panthers, school busing, and other excesses of youth counterculture. These conservative Americans were known as the silent majority, and many of them were Democrats, Southern whites, and also Northern Catholic blue-collar workers, and also some suburbanites. These people were similar in that they didn't like the liberal drift of their Democratic Party. So to win the South, the president asked the federal courts to delay integration and busing orders, and he also nominated conservatives to the Supreme Court of the United States. The courts and the Senate rejected this, but his strategy still played well with Southern white voters, and he was able to win more. He also said bad things about war protesters and attacked the press as too liberal. So to back up his conservatism, Nixon decided to appoint conservative justices, but these justices didn't always rule as he had hoped. In 1969, Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Warren Court resigned, so he appointed Warren E. Burger of Minnesota to replace him. This court was more conservative than the liberal Warren Court, but many of its decisions weren't really conservative. For example, it allowed busing, which was assigning and transporting students to other schools to try to achieve a racial balance in previously segregated schools. The death penalty also became more difficult to get during this time, and in the last days of Nixon's Watergate scandal, the court denied his claims to executive privilege and ordered him to turn over these Watergate tapes in U.S. versus Nixon, 1974. However, the most controversial was definitely probably Roe v. Wade in 1973. Norma McCorvey wanted an abortion in Texas, so this is her right here, and she was known as Jane Roe in the courts. And in the 7-2 decision, the High Court struck down many state laws prohibiting abortions because they thought it was a violation of a woman's right to privacy. Even to this day, there are many protests trying to overturn this very controversial decision on abortion. The Watergate scandal was a public humiliation of Nixon, and it involved the conviction and jailing of many White House officials and aides. It severely damaged the political system of America, and it was probably one of the most long-lasting legacies of Nixon's administration. In June of 1972, a group of men who were hired by Nixon's re-election committee were caught breaking into the offices of the Democratic National Convention's headquarters in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. This break-in, and they were trying to bug certain things, was part of a series of illegal activities and dirty tricks, and it was conducted by the Committee to Re-elect the President, which just so happens to be CREEP. Earlier, Nixon had tried to wiretap many government employees and reporters because he didn't want news leaks such as the Pentagon Papers to continue, and also ones that had exposed the secret bombing of Cambodia. These aides created a group, and they were called the Plumbers, to stop these leaks, and they also wanted to discredit opponents who were trying to take Nixon down. They burglarized and investigated people who opposed his policies. There was no solid proof that Nixon had ordered any of these illegal activities at first, but after months of investigations by 2 Washington Post reporters, it became clear that Nixon did engage in these cover-ups to avoid scandal. there was a lot of tough sentencing for these burglars, and information about illegal money and pardons by White House staff to keep these burglars quiet were eventually used to get these people for obstructing justice. There was also a discovery of a taping system in the Oval Office that Nixon had instituted. He tried to record everything he was saying and other people were saying in the White House. Nixon didn't want to turn over these tapes for a year, and he claimed executive privilege for these tapes, and investigators really wanted these tapes to prove these cover-ups. But in the fall of 1973, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign because he had taken bribes while governor of Maryland, and so Michigan Representative Gerald Ford had to replace him. Basically, this showed that all around Nixon, things were coming apart, and eventually the Watergate scandal proved that Nixon knew of this, and eventually he had to resign. That is the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and that is Gerald Ford, who would eventually become Nixon's replacement. Nixon had to resign because of his involvement in illegal activity instead of facing impeachment, and so his new vice president, Gerald Ford, replaced him. Congress for years had Gerald Ford as a representative from Michigan, and he was also the Republican minority leader in the House. In the first month of taking office, he granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crime that might have been committed. He was accused of making a corrupt bargain, so this is kind of like Henry Clay, old 1800s corrupt bargain time with Nixon, and the purpose of the pardon, as said by Ford, was to end the national nightmare of Watergate. Critics didn't like this, and it was because the full truth of Nixon's deeds would never have to come out in a court. During Ford's presidency, the Democrats in Congress and the CIA searched for these executive branch abuses of the Nixon administration, and Ford appointed former Texas Congressman George H.W. Bush to try to reform this agency. Following this, during his administration, there were also major events, such as the fall of Saigon. In 1975, Vietnam became one country when the Communist North government in Hanoi took over the South and reunited Vietnam. This was a low point in American prestige overseas, and it lowered confidence of American military at home. There's also a genocide in Cambodia. The U.S. supported the government in Vietnam's neighbor, Cambodia, but it eventually fell to the Khmer Rouge, which was a radical communist faction that killed more than 1 million people in a genocide. This produced, between these two events, it produced a lot of refugees, and many of these eventually fled to the United States. So many people were questioning, does this mean the domino theory is coming into effect? Some thought yes, but others thought no, because other nations such as Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia were emerging as little tigers who were a part of this very fast-growing Asian or Pacific Rim economy that was countering this communism with their own form of capitalism. Ford decided not to run again, and so a number of Democrats wanted to take their party's nomination and win the election. And a little-known former governor of Georgia, James Earl, or Jimmy Carter, was the nominee. He was an outsider against this corruption in Washington, and he managed to win a close election, and he got a lot of the African American vote as well. In the aftermath of Watergate, the Democrats also won strong majorities in both houses of Congress because many thought the Republicans couldn't be trusted. Jimmy Carter had an informal style as presidency. He walked down Pennsylvania Avenue instead of being in a limousine, and he carried his own luggage. However, veteran members of Congress didn't always like Carter because they thought he depended too much on his politically inexperienced advisors back from Georgia. Carter's probably greatest single achievement was arranging a peace settlement between Egypt and Israel, who were fighting a lot during this time. In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat visited Israeli Prime Minister Begin in Jerusalem, and they formed this peace treaty. Carter then invited these two to meet again at a presidential retreat in Camp David, Maryland, and these people sort of solidified this agreement. Carter was the intermediary, and these two leaders negotiated the Camp David Accords, which was signed in September of 1978. It was a framework for a peace settlement between their countries and the rest of the Middle East, as during this time, Israel was fighting basically all of the Arab world since they got their own homeland from Britain. Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize the nation of Israel, and in return, Israel withdrew its troops from the Sinai territory that it had taken from Egypt in the Six-Day War of 1967. However, this treaty was opposed by many people in the Arab world, especially the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, whose lands had been taken from them when Israel was initiated as a nation. The Middle East also turned out to be Carter's greatest frustration. There were many problems in the Middle East. For example, in Iran, there was a lot of anti-American sentiment since the CIA had overthrown the government in 1953. In 1979, Islamic fundamentalists led by Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah, who was then leading this government. And the Shah had kept the oil flowing for the West, as the West wanted him to during the 70s. But his autocratic rule and policy of westernization didn't capture a big part of the Iranian population. All the money that this oil revenue generated went to the Shah and his rich friends. Iranian oil production ground to a halt after this Iranian revolution, and a second worldwide oil shortage in a decade soon came, as did another round of price increases. Iranian militants soon after this seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran, and held more than 50 members of the American staff as prisoners and hostages. So Carter tried to approve a rescue mission, but the helicopters broke down in the Iranian desert, and the United States had to abort this mission. These unsuccessful attempts to free the hostages eventually became a symbol of a failed presidency, and he was not able to win the next election. There was a wide movement by a variety of minorities during this time, and many of them wanted relief from discrimination and recognition for their contributions to U.S. societies. One of the most prominent minority groups were Hispanic Americans. They had come before World War II and lived as braceros, helping out with agriculture and stuff. After the war, there were new arrivals from various other places, such as Puerto Rico, Cuba, and South and Central America. And these people settled in the East and Midwest, taking on many similar jobs. Mexicans also returned after the Great Depression, after they were deported, to take low-paying agricultural jobs. However, these workers were exploited, and after a long series of boycotts led by Cesar Chavez and the organization he founded, the United Farm Workers Organization, or UFW, he finally was able to gain collective bargaining rights for farm workers in 1975. This really helped the people have more rights and recognition for their work in helping America's agriculture. He also helped to win a federal mandate for bilingual education, requiring schools to teach Hispanic children in both English and Spanish, so the kids wouldn't lose their culture. In 2000, Hispanics became the country's largest minority group. In the 50s, the Eisenhower administration tried to encourage American Indians to leave reservations and assimilate into this urban America. Well, the leaders didn't like this loss of cultural identity, so they wanted self-determination and a revival of tribal traditions, and the American Indian Movement, or AIM, was founded in 1968. Militant action soon followed. They took over Alcatraz prison in San Francisco Bay, and they held it for more than a year. They also occupied Wounded Knee, South Dakota, which was the site of the 1890 massacre. They had successes in both Congress and the courts. Congress and the courts both recognized their sovereignty. Congress passed an Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975. This allowed reservations and tribal lands greater control over the programs inside of them, also education and law enforcement. American Indians also used federal courts to try to regain property and compensation for all the previous treaty violations in U.S. history. This organization really tried to attack unemployment and poverty with education. They built industries and also gambling casinos because they had the right to self-determine themselves. And on these reservations, they were soon able to gain much more money and to improve their status, although today, still many Native Americans are poor. So these industries haven't helped tremendously. In 1969, a police raid on the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in Greenwich Village in New York City, sparked both a riot and the gay rights movement. Gay activists hoped that homosexuals would be more open about their identity and to try to work to end the discrimination and abuse in America at the time. The 1970s was a big time for the environmental movement to grow. As known before, the progressive era conservation movement was small and led by a bunch of Republicans such as Theodore Roosevelt, while the modern environmental movement had more popular support around the nation. 20 million citizens participated in the first Earth Day in 1970, and they were concerned over air and water pollution, which was becoming worse and worse, and the destruction of natural environments. And this, of course, also affected wildlife. Media coverage of industrial disasters questioned people's thoughts, and it really led people to think that industry and new technologies weren't always good. Oil spills, such as in California and the Exxon Valdez oil tanker accident in Alaska, really showed that human error and modern technology could have bad effects. Also, nuclear power plant explosions at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania and Chernobyl in the Soviet Union continued this train of thought. Protective legislation was enacted in the 70s. The Clean Air Act was created, and the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, was created in 1972 with the Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act of 1973. A Superfund was later added to try to give resources to clean up toxic dumps and to regulate these toxic substances that were going into public drinking water systems, and also to regulate the dumping of waste and protect these natural environments, and also to help wildlife, such as the American bald eagle, who were losing big populations during this time to bad pesticides such as DDT. In the 80s, the backlash from business and industries would try to reverse this whole movement, as it still does today. However, this environmental movement really started to grow, even till today, and it was all because of the efforts of environmentalists during the 70s, a turning point in American times. So this has been Chapter 29 of AMSCO U.S. History, Limits of a Superpower, about the U.S. during the Nixon years. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one, when we continue the story of America.